Thanks, Mel, and hi, welcome everyone. Um, I'm Holly. James, do you want to start us off by introducing yourself, and then I'll introduce myself and dive into the presentation?
Sure thing. Yeah, I'm James Connell. I'm our intake and assessment administrator. I'm going to be helping Holly navigate the chat and any questions and all that good stuff. I'll send it your way, Holly.
Thanks, James. And hi, everyone. My name is Holly Harris Younger. I use she, her pronouns, and I have the privilege and opportunity to serve as the human trafficking and sex abuse specialist with the Colorado Department of Human Services and the Division of Child Welfare. I'm really excited to be here with you all today, even though it's really cold outside, to talk with you all about human trafficking. Just as a little bit of background about me, I've been in this position with the state for just about over 2 years now. Prior to that, I worked for almost 9 years at a large county doing direct child welfare casework practice. And a lot of that work was with families and young people who were either at risk of trafficking or had been trafficked or were, victimized in other ways, or just in general, had some vulnerabilities that brought them into, intersection and touching the child welfare system. In addition to that work, I have my undergrad in social work and my master's in social work, and the emphasis of my capstone project for my master's was really around that intersection between child welfare and human trafficking. So this is an area that I'm really passionate about, and I'm continuing to learn about as well, because, right, we always love to learn. So bear with me while I share my screen and get started. Right, okay, there we go. So just to start, for today's purposes, our presentation, we're going to talk about what is human trafficking, how it intersects with child welfare, maybe some ideas around how to identify it, and then I always like to leave folks with some resources to support children and families. Does that sound like a good plan? Great, wonderful. Also, feel free to ask questions as we're going. I know that from speaking for myself, if I don't ask right away or write it down right away, I might forget it. So please feel free to utilize the chat, ask questions, but we'll also make sure we have some time at the end to talk through anything else that comes up. And I also just like to share with folks, sometimes talking about human trafficking can be really heavy. And so I just would also encourage folks, if you need to take a break or step away, that won't bother me. Just really do try to take care of yourselves. All right, let's go. So what is human trafficking? I'm going to ask for a little participation from folks, so hopefully you don't mind. But I'm wondering if folks can either put in the chat or come off mute and share, when you hear human trafficking, what are some phrases or terms that come to mind? Taken advantage of. Thanks, Victoria. Moving people against their will. Thanks, Jeremy. Coercion. Yes, Mel. Absolutely. Child abduction. Thanks, Mike, for adding that in. Victoria also added held hostage, either literally or by threatening to have them deported. Thanks. Any other thoughts or phrases that come to mind? Oh, Cindy added in being forced into situations. Yeah, so all of these are things that I think we'll be able to talk through and kind of tease out what that looks like and how it really, a little bit more about what human trafficking is. So what is human trafficking? So this slide really kind of illustrates the federal definition of human trafficking from the Trafficking Victims Protection or Prevention Act. It's kind of sparsed out into two different categories: sex trafficking and labor trafficking. So labor trafficking is defined as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjugation to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. So again, right, we're hearing that it's essentially right like a severe form of exploitation through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. For sex trafficking, pretty similar. The recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act. And when a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not yet attained 18 years of age. So I'm going to break this down a little bit more. So essentially, right, sex trafficking is a form of exploitation where there is a commercial sex act against their will. The caveat here, though, is that anyone under the age of 18, through society, through how it's been, put out through society, cannot consent to engaging in commercial sex. So I like to point out both of these, right? Because human trafficking, in a lot of ways and spaces, it's been mostly identified as like sex trafficking, right? But labor trafficking is also a form of human trafficking, and it is, again, another form of extreme exploitation that we're seeing in our state. So now that you guys kind of have these definitions, I want you all to kind of to think through and reflect on how human trafficking has been portrayed in like movies. So thinking like Taken, Sounds of Freedom, right? Those are some of the bigger, more mainstream movies of recent times where it kind of shows in a Hollywood way what human trafficking is. That someone was kidnapped against their will and forced to do something else, right? And that someone swooped in and saved them. And I like to point this out and really do a little bit of myth busting at the start, because while those are great Hollywood blockbusters, that's not the real experience of most victims and survivors of human trafficking. People are living their lives and oftentimes going in and out of their trafficking experience on a daily basis. So some other facts I like to share around what human trafficking is that most traffickers are using psychological means of control, right? So there is like tricking that happens, manipulating, threatening. Those sorts of things are kind of some of the, and we'll dive into that a little bit more as we go. And another fact I always just like to share is just around, that globally, it's estimated that there are more victims of labor trafficking than there are of sex trafficking. So pausing there, how does some of this information kind of land for you all, as far as like what you have known or believed or heard previously about what human trafficking is? If anyone's feeling a little bit shocked, like that's okay. Most people are a little bit shocked when they hear about like what it actually can look like. So I also think it can be really helpful sometimes to hear about like, all right, so we know the legal definition. How does that actually look like in someone's day-to-day life? So starting with labor trafficking, some of how we see that happening is, especially in like certain parts of Colorado, that can look like forced criminality, right? Where people may be, I guess an example could be a young person grows up in a community where there's a lot of gang activity. They're seeking a sense of belonging, so they do join up with the gang. And in order to remain as part of that, they've been added into the gang, and in order to maintain their status or to continue to have the protection of the gang or to not be assaulted because they're trying to get out of the gang, they're forced to do some sort of criminal activity. So that could be a form of labor trafficking. We're also seeing labor trafficking. Sometimes that happens in migrant work. Sometimes that also happens, individuals with disabilities are sometimes exploited. There's been stories of, folks essentially having like their like Social Security held in and not being able to access that unless they're like complying or doing other work. It can also look like, false job offers, right? Sometimes folks might be right, like what would anyone do to try and have their basic needs met? So those are some of the examples of what labor trafficking can look like. Again, sex trafficking is that exchange, right, for commercial sex in exchange for something of value. Consider what does a commercial sex act entail? That could be a contact, like an actual sex act, like intercourse or otherwise. But it could also be the trading of like photos or exchanging of photos for something of value. And we're talking about something of value. It's not just money. It could be shelter. It could be food. It could be substances. It could be anything that anyone might have any kind of value for, right? And so really considering that, historically it's been called survival sex, but when a young person exchanges, or any person, we'll stick with young people because that's my wheelhouse, but when a young person exchanges any kind of sex act in exchange for like food or a place to stay, like that's historically been considered survival sex, but really that's buyer perpetrated trafficking, right? That person who's exchanged a sex act for shelter has been, it's exploitation, right? We also see sex trafficking happening, right, historically, right? We see it a lot commonly with like pimps or like a third party person controlling another individual. Oftentimes it's someone that is known to the person that's being trafficked and they've been groomed into that situation. But it can also happen in the context of a family. Sometimes we've heard stories of individuals having been groomed from a very young age into maybe like a pedophile ring, or I'm trying to think other examples. There's like a generational approach where like this is how our family has always known or had ability to earn income or make our ends meet. So this is just how we do it as a family. Like I had to do this when I was a kid so that my family had a place to stay. So now it's your turn, right? Exchanging like access to a child in exchange for maybe rent or something else. And again, right, the exchange of any kind of child sex abuse material. So those are some general examples of what it can look like for there to be human trafficking happening. All right, this next slide I know is really busy, so I apologize, but I think it's just really important to kind of look through and talk through and understand like how complex human trafficking really can be. So if you start over here with some of in the corner where it's green and yellow, where it says push-pull factors, I look at these as factors that may lead someone to being, either pushed or pulled into vulnerability to be exploited. So we're talking like desire for a better life, wanting to have solid relationships, real or perceived debt, having unmet needs, abuse and neglect, and isolation. So feeling isolated or from your family. So the example I like to use a lot is, so say there is a young person who identifies as part of being the LGBTQ community and queer. That young person maybe is feeling some isolation or rejection from their family of origin because their family doesn't accept them for how they're identifying in whatever way that might be. Maybe they've been kicked out of the house or they feel really unwelcome at home. Say they're living out on the streets and they're now experiencing homelessness. What are, in that situation, think through like what are the push and pull factors that maybe are leading to that young person being more vulnerable. They want to have a place where they feel like they belong and they can be authentic to who they are. They're feeling isolated because they weren't having that from their family of origin, right? And again, it's not necessarily that their identity makes them vulnerable, but the experience they may have as part of interacting with society where it's not as accepting as others. And then if we move over to the risk factors, these are experiences that many people might have, right? Running away, homelessness, or housing insecurity, having multiple systems being involved with you. These are all experiences that could potentially create risk for exploitation. And then at the bottom, we have some of our indicators. And I left this in here because I think it can be helpful to recognize that these might be things that a young person who's vulnerable for trafficking are experiencing. But just because they're experiencing there's only one on this whole entire page that confirms that they're a victim of trafficking. A young person could experience all of these and not experience trafficking, or they could experience none of these and be a victim of trafficking too. But I think it's helpful to know, like, hey, these are things that maybe should spark some curiosity to go back to those push-pull factors around what's missing or what's happening that's creating that vulnerability. So if we're seeing like a sexually explicit social media posts, or we're seeing like sudden truancy or even long-standing truancy, contentious relationships and a lack of support, all of these things. So I'll pause here and just kind of let you all read through this, but also would welcome, if anyone has seen any of these and, wants to share out, or has questions, I suppose. Or reflections. I'll take reflections as well. Jeremy, I saw you come off mute.
For me, like you said, neglect or abuse. What sticks with me is, like you said, doesn't necessarily have to be trafficking, but we've experienced it probably sometime in our life. I didn't think that it could tie into the trafficking portion initially, but I guess that after you explained it, it seems how it can factor in.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think having experienced abuse or neglect, and this is true for minors, but I something that I like to reflect on and think on too is like there's also adult survivors and victims of human trafficking, and that's been something like through research that has shown up is like, hey, yeah, they had experienced some sort of abuse or neglect previously, and sometimes that is within the context of the family. Sometimes that abuse may also be, part of a grooming process that was exerted to maintain that power and control. And we'll get into the grooming process in a minute as well.
Holly, is there any other terms or terminology used regarding human trafficking or and the only reason I'm saying that is because I was just thinking if our young people are familiar with the traits or the signs or versus if somebody say, oh, this sounds like this may be human trafficking. And like, no, she's just hanging out with one of her friends or whatever the case may be. Is there any kind of, maybe urban words that is used for human trafficking or instead of just human trafficking?
Marsha, I really appreciate your question because I think this is one of those things. Like a kid's not going to know what human trafficking is, right? Many adults don't even know what human trafficking is, and they're not going to. How I think you nailed it on the head. They're not. If you're like, hey, I'm really worried that you might be being trafficked. Like they're going to be like, what? No, that's not. That doesn't reflect my experience at all. That's not like because they've also seen Taken or Sounds of Freedom or some
Right.
other like glorified version of
Mm-hmm.
what human trafficking is, and they're like, well, that's not what I'm experiencing. What I'm experiencing is that the cliche example, like my significant other is like has hit me, and now I have to do these things to keep having them love me and provide for me.
Yeah. And
Right.
keeping up with the young people, it's always other terms. I always just kind of reflect back to when we were sharing awareness of homelessness, and folks is looking around like, not me, not me, not me. And come to find out, you've been experiencing homelessness for forever, and it just was never used in that in those terms. So I know it's a stretch, but these young people keep changing in all of these processes. At first we used to look at the area that was under the viaduct, under not Colfax, but now they didn't change to this a whole freeway now. So I don't know where the trafficking exchanges happen, but it used to happen under the freeway I-70, right? And you see people coming from McDonald's, and I've seen young girls with no shoes on, and you're like, oh my goodness, honey, you have to have shoes. And they're like, no, 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 thank you. And they go back in the bushes and wait for whoever's supposed to pick them up. And so it's just things like that. You're like, wow, maybe if we, you know, I don't know, found out the other terms, what are they using on the street to say this is what this is?
Yeah. One, I think the lingo is constantly changing, right? Like when I first got into anti-trafficking, it was known as like the life, and like people were working tracks, and some of that lingo still exists. But again, like even like recognizing like the life and working tracks, and having like dates or tricks and all of those things, that some folks, really savvy traffickers maybe are making it so covert what's happening that they may not recognize that that's what it is. And so I think whenever possible, like if you're talking with a young person or with a family and they're using, picking up on the language that they're using and reflecting back to them, and kind of, I always advocate for like taking an approach of curiosity and be like, oh, what does that mean for you? So that I know the language that you're using and I can relate and make sure that we're on the same page around it. And again, I think also the onus of recognizing that it's human trafficking isn't on the young person, right? That's on the professionals and the other folks around them. And even then, they maybe are experiencing human trafficking, but I would bargain to say like many survivors of trafficking don't want that to define their experience and their existence and how they interact with society around them. Like they've had life experiences. And so is it always about defining their experience as a human trafficking experience, or saying like, hey, this person has some unmet needs that led to them maybe experiencing harm, and how can we address those unmet needs? But I love
Great,
the
thank
question.
you.
I love the dialogue. I think it's really great. Oh, I saw we have a comment, Victoria. Monitoring wise, I've seen this in phone calls always being on speakerphone, and case manager staff could hear someone on the background telling them what to say, telling her she couldn't come to her appointment, plus intimidation. It was paired with her having to give him a portion of her check, holding onto her card, him taking away a phone and always being the one to answer, trying to become her payee. Yeah. I think all of those things that you shared out, Victoria, are things that would cause maybe some pause for concern around like, what are the dynamics there that person is experiencing, right? Like if they always have a partner or someone else with them that speaks for them in appointments, why is that? Like what's going on? Is it because they like are seeking like an interpreter whenever possible? Can we have like a third party neutral interpreter present for folks that aren't able to speak English? And some of the other folks I collaborate with in the anti-trafficking movement also really encourage folks to try to build in like to policy or to practice within agencies, like opportunity for having like those one-on-one conversations with folks. Just as like, hey, this is one of our standard practices. We have to interview everyone all alone. Sorry, other person who's here, we can't have you here right now. But I think, being aware that those are things that may like send up the spidey senses like, hey, this is kind of risky and concerning. I should look into this a bit more. I appreciate that. Yeah. Other thoughts or reflections on this one? again, of all the indicators, there's only one on here that like confirms that someone is a victim of trafficking, right? And is when they have self-reported, when a minor has self-reported exchange of sex acts for shelter, food, substances, or anything else of value. Like when that has been self-reported, that's the only thing that can like really confirm that it's happened out of the potential identifiers. So grooming. Traffickers are really savvy. They're skilled and able to identify who's vulnerable, what their vulnerabilities are. You know, as you all as service providers, like you all know where the vulnerable people are that you're working with, right? You know where they hang out, you know where they spend their time. Traffickers do too. I include this too, also just to kind of show out like what the different I say stages, but it's not really like a one and done thing, but the different pieces of the grooming process, right? So that starts with targeting victim. Again, we talked about that, right? Traffickers are skilled. They know where the vulnerable people are. They may befriend or gain trust with that vulnerable person. And then once they have gained trust, they'll meet their needs. Like, oh, hey, it's like snowing really bad outside and you're here on the street. Like, if you come with me, I have a warm hotel where you can stay. And some food, and like, okay, well, now that I've met your need, like, and we've built this rapport, like, all right, now you kind of owe me. And that's when it can like switch into like the exploitation piece. But there's also a lot of times where isolation can happen, where sometimes that can look like a trafficker being like, hey, you know, I'm the only one that gets you. I'm the only one that understands you. These other systems have failed you time and time again. I have shown up for you. Right? Those are maybe some of the words or tactics a trafficker could use to start doing some of that isolation. And then, of course, exploitation, that, right? Like, hey, like, you got to do this for me, or what that might look like. And then there's other tactics traffickers can use to maintain control. Sometimes that's could be like, for example, like if there's an individual who's a foreign national and they are here and they have gone through this and they've been targeted, they've been exploited. Well, hey, if you don't keep doing this for me, I have people that know your family back in your home country, and I will have them go see your family if you don't keep doing this for me. Right? That could be an egregious an example of how that maintaining control can look. But it also can look very similar to what happens in like the DV cycle, right? When especially like if it is one of those situations where it is in the trafficking is occurring in the premise of like a romantic partnership context, right? Abuse happens, and then there's kind of like that back into the honeymoon stage where maybe you're rebuilding your relationship. I'm so sorry, but this is for the good of us, like, you know, those sorts of things. So it can look pretty similar. Terry, I saw you come off mute. Maybe.
Hi, sorry, I was joining late. I don't know how I came off mute. I don't have a question, but thank you.
Of course. Sometimes
Sorry about that.
That's okay. We were talking earlier about how Zoom just sets you up to come in off mute. So welcome. Glad you're here. Yeah, so the grooming cycle and something that I would really consider for folks to think through is like, my understanding is you're not just working with a young person, you're also working with families too. And so I'd really encourage you all to think through on how this grooming cycle might look in these different settings where you're working with children and families, you know, at the home. Like, what do those dynamics look like within the home, within the community? Especially in today's day and age with how online everything is, a lot of this is happening. You know, this grooming can happen online very easily for young people. And so what can that look like, that, you know, and with how fast technology moves, like what can be like an in-person, like weeks, months long process of grooming someone to be exploited, online it happens much, much faster, right? They're building relationships with that guise of anonymity, like some of those inhibitions to send things are down, right, for young people. And it just happens a lot faster online. So why does it matter? Why is it important to understand and know what human trafficking is? Well, there has been research done, and it indicates that between 66 and 75% of victims and survivors of human trafficking had some sort of prior child welfare contact. I say this because I think it's a fascinating number. 66 to 75%, like 1 in 3 maybe, of victims and survivors of trafficking had child welfare experience. And I think some of the data where that comes from, like, I think it depends on the study why there's such a range. But I think it really speaks to the experiences of people that happened for them that also led them into like needing to come into contact with child welfare. Have they experienced, some socioeconomic distress? Has there been other factors that occurred within the family context that were maybe harmful or unsafe? Yeah, it's just really, a lot that goes into it. I also like to highlight, and we kind of touched on it earlier, but victims aren't going to be able to self-identify. I share this out too, like in my years of doing casework practice, I only ever had one young person that I ever worked with that was like, oh yeah, I've been exploited. And the only reason they were able to say that is because it wasn't my first time working with them for having been exploited before. It wasn't their first time working with child welfare, going through all of our processes and having the conversations about like what exploitation looks like and what human trafficking looks like. I put in here too, like most victims of trafficking, no one are familiar with their perpetrators. It could be someone they met that they formed some sort of connection with. It could be a family member. It could be, maybe someone that has had a position in their life that took advantage of that. I think human trafficking is also really complex because there's social stigma and perception around labor, right? There's unfortunately, sometimes there is a lot of like values based around like different types of labor, but also around sex, right? Like a lot of folks are really uncomfortable to talk about like sex and what makes a healthy sexual relationship. And so I think that can also add to the complexity of it. And then the human trafficking is really clandestine. It's really hidden. It's hard to, right? Think back on that page where we saw all these indicators, but there was still only one thing that would indicate human trafficking happened, right? And even if someone experienced everything else on there, they may still not have been a victim of trafficking. It's just really complex and it's really hidden and hard to identify. Some other information that I think is really helpful, from a Colorado context is that that we have in Colorado the Colorado Human Trafficking Council. Is anyone familiar with that group by chance? Well, they are considered a board and commission through the state. They're legislatively established, and they have a really big, I think they might be one of the largest boards and commissions in the state of Colorado. And their legislative, duty is to, collect data around what human trafficking looks like in Colorado and what service provision is looking like to address it, amongst a few other things. And they put out a report every month, and I can link that in for folks that are interested. But from their report from 2023, just something that I think is really interesting. Right. So there's a lot of different levels at which human trafficking as a crime is investigated and looked at. It could be the FBI, HSI, local police, depending on kind of the jurisdiction. But the FBI does have a child exploitation and human trafficking task force here in Colorado. And in 2022, they had 28 investigations that led to 23 arrests. 23 arrests. HSI had 41 investigations, and across the state judicial, 28 cases total were filed. I think it's also really interesting to kind of like on the flip side, think about, how does that trickle down? And that's not just minors, that's people of all ages, right? Infant through end of life. From the child welfare point of view, between January 1st of this year, and I believe it was, sorry, I'm looking up my numbers. And between January and May of this year, we had 201 total referrals come into the state child welfare abuse and neglect hotline with concerns of human trafficking. So I share this just to kind of help support, the understanding around like what prevalence is known to look like for human trafficking, while also highlighting that it is really clandestine and hidden and hard to recognize. So mandatory reporters who suspect abuse and neglect are required to report that, right? In between 2016 and 2019, there was Colorado legislation that added both human trafficking, like sex trafficking, and labor trafficking to the definition of child abuse and neglect. So for any of you all who are mandatory reporters, if you see or suspect that a child is a victim of human trafficking, that is one of those things that is required to be reported as a mandatory reporter. I highlight this because how it was incorporated into statute says that even when it's a third party perpetrator of trafficking, so maybe it's not happening, like maybe a parent or caregiver isn't the one that's trafficking a child, but John down the street, the neighbor guy who's made friends with this young person, if he's exploiting that person, it would still qualify as abuse or neglect and be required to be reported through the hotline. And I say this because it's important because, historically, right, child welfare lives in that realm of if it happens within the context of a family. But this was added in because we recognize that sometimes a young person may be trafficked without there being another person benefiting financially from the trafficking experience, right? If we think back to like that third party perpetrated trafficking or survival sex, right? There isn't like a trafficker that's benefiting. There's a sex buyer who's exploiting a young person who has unmet needs, but that still is considered human trafficking. For anyone who is a mandatory reporter who calls and reports it, our hotline and our counties all have access to enhanced screening questions to help gather as much information as possible about what the concerns are so that counties, when they receive and review those reports, can make the best informed decision that they can. And I'm going to pause because I think I see a comment in the chat. Can you share how you keep a person being trafficked safe from others? Is there information, classes, workshops, etc., that we can share with parents experiencing this type of abuse for their children? Marsha, I love that. And yes, we will get to that. We'll talk through some strategies for promoting safety and supporting families and young people. Absolutely. Yeah, so I have on here again the CO for Kids hotline for folks that are mandatory reporters. And I also think it's really helpful for you all to know, as folks that may be mandatory reporters or folks that may be really worried about a young person or their family and call into the hotline, what that process looks like. So once a report is received, county child welfare staff will review that report to determine if it meets legal definition and criteria for assignment to be assessed. When it does, it's assigned within a certain time frame. A county child welfare worker will go out and meet with the family and the young person and really kind of do a deep dive around what's going on, what are the unmet needs, what can that look like. Depending on the situation, if abuse or neglect is happening, like what further intervention is needed. And when that happens, I think it can create an opportunity for collaboration with our partner systems. So sometimes it might look like we need to better communicate with the school or the mental health providers that are working with the family or the shelter that the family is staying with to help wrap around and support this family and this young person to, again, address those push-pull factors that are leading to that risk and vulnerability for exploitation. And then oftentimes child welfare staff will engage families with support planning or safety planning depending on what happens. And sometimes that happens in the context where a family is going to be involved in an ongoing manner or a little bit longer term with a family beyond 60 days. Or sometimes that could mean like, hey, this family has like general access and skills and capabilities to keep this family safe. So we're going to support plan with them for how to keep that going and strengthen and bolster those things. James, did you have anything to add regarding kind of what the process looks like for welfare?
I think that hits the high level of it. Certainly welcome questions, though.
Yeah, absolutely. So if folks have questions kind of about what child welfare's response looks like when we receive reports of concern for human trafficking, would be happy to share. One thing while folks are thinking, though, I will add is that we across Colorado utilize a human trafficking screen to help. That's one of the requirements of child welfare staff. When we receive a report with concerns of human trafficking, child welfare staff are required to complete a human trafficking screen to better understand, again, what are those vulnerabilities for trafficking, and the intent behind that is to then, again, address those unmet needs. And it's not just child welfare staff that are using the same tool. We have, Division of Youth Services folks use the same tool. Colorado Youth Detention Continuum, other folks I've known, some of you all may be aware of like human trafficking multidisciplinary teams where systems come together to work towards, addressing those unmet needs and supporting young people. Some MDTs even use the tool. So that's just one of those things, but I'll pause there and see if folks have any questions about what happens around like the child welfare process. All right, hearing none, I'll keep us going. Marsha, this is kind of where I was gonna get to your question and your comment. So this slide, I really tried to accumulate some quick resources for folks. This is a brief training, right? If you're curious and want to learn more, and included in here are some other opportunities for training and learning more. Child welfare has a 3-hour web-based training, but the Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking is available. They do great trainings. They have an upcoming public awareness training that's virtual as well that I'd be happy to email to share over their flyer if you want to pass it along. But the Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking, they don't just provide training. They also operate our Colorado statewide human trafficking tip line. So if you're working with an adult who you don't have, like, isn't needing to be mandatory reported on, but you're concerned, you can call in a tip to the Colorado Human Trafficking tip line. They also hold a really big statewide resource database where they can work with folks or have worked with folks to be like, hey, you know about human trafficking, you're trained, can we refer people to your agency should you need some help and support? So that's also available. I also have linked in the Colorado Human Trafficking Council on here. They have a bunch of different trainings. They have a law enforcement training, they have a basic training, but they also offer a training for service providers to support service providers in ensuring that the programming and processes and policies and practice that they're implementing is done in a way that is trauma informed to support survivors of human trafficking. It's kind of set up like a workshop, and it's something that, if your agency is interested in continuing to work with victims of human trafficking or just wants to be a place that would be good to work with human trafficking victims and survivors, it's available and linked in there, and would recommend folks at least explore it if they're interested. I also have linked in here the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. They're the national clearinghouse for taking reports when children or youth are missing. They have a lot of different programs, but I link it in here because they have web-based trainings. But if you're working with a family whose young person has been exploited or is missing or running away, they have family support programming that can be of assistance to families, right? And if we're thinking about like secondary victimization, like if you are a family and your young person has been exploited or they're constantly running away, it can feel really isolating as well. And so they have a virtual like team group, like a Team Hope, which is like a virtual like support group kind of where it's like parents that have experienced either their kid running away or their kid being trafficked, kind of coming together to support one another. They have a few other, supports and resources as well. But also I think it's helpful to know, like, if you're working with a family and their child or young person is missing, that they can report their child not only to law enforcement is missing, but to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And they can, they have access to work with retired law enforcement. They can essentially like use a bunch of different databases to comb through like social media, Craigslist, known escort sites, all of these different places where young people might be being posted for potential exploitation. But they can also do like missing posters and just kind of work with families on like, okay, so when we find your kid, how can we get in there and get them what they need right away so that they don't run away again? So that's one thing that NCMEC can offer. And then SOAR is just another opportunity for additional training. And then, the resources to support, youth and families. So I always love linking in the Colorado Sexual Health Initiative because they do some really phenomenal work with like comprehensive sex education and creating, space for young people to like be curious in a way that's like safe and appropriate around like sexuality and sexual development. Those things. I see it as maybe like a form of harm reduction, right? If a young person is able to be empowered to, access like birth control or, other, condoms or things like that to help them be safer. It may not get them out of being exploited, but it may help them feel like they're not being harmed as much, maybe like safer. I also link in here information about Colorado youth labor laws. Knowledge is power, right? Yeah, having a job and earning an income is like can be a really positive and healthy thing for a young person. And when they know what their rights are as a young worker, it creates a safer opportunity for them. So I linked this in here because I think, hey, you want a job? That's great. Let's get you a job. But here's what is like okay for you to experience as a young worker. I also have linked in here the National Runaway Safe Line. It's something that you can provide to young people if they are on the run or if they're running away. This is a way for them to like have like a breadcrumb trail for safety. I also included in here the internet safety resources. We talked a little bit about how, right, so much of how grooming and targeting of victims has moved online. This is just some tools to like help have those conversations with young people around like being safe online or supporting families to have those conversations. And then I also linked in some safety planning information. I'll just say real quick that safety planning from a child welfare context can look a bit differently, but I know that many service providers engage with families to like create plans on how to keep their children safe. And so this link has some good information around what that can look like and some tips and tricks. I think some of the things that I've seen be incredibly successful, I don't know if I'd say incredibly, but has had more success when working with young people who are victims or at risk of being victimized is just having like a safe, consistent adult, whether it's a relative or someone else, just having that ride or die person that'll show up for them. And so I think creating as much like opportunity for building a network of safety and support for young people can be one of the bigger things to help kind of mitigate some of that risk. And all of these will be hyperlinked into the presentation that I'll get over to Mel so that she can share it out. I think I saw that was your question there, Marcia, for information. And really, that's kind of what I have for you all today. And so we have about 7-ish minutes left for questions.
I don't really have a question but a comment. So thank you, Holly. This was very eye-opening. I didn't even see or know most of this stuff. So thank you.
Thank you. And I will make sure to get this slide deck over to you, Mel, so that you can send it out with the recording for folks. And my contact information is in there. If anyone, next week has like questions like, oh, I wonder, like, please feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to talk through and connect and support, how this work can look.